Winter had a way of softening Windhell Ridge, turning the town into a muted watercolor where every sound seemed to hush itself before reaching the air. Snow drifted like quiet confetti around lantern poles, settling on rooftops that had seen more seasons than most of the people who lived beneath them. On those nights, when the wind curled down the chimneys and the sky paled to a fragile gray, it felt as if the world held its breath to listen for stories. And there, at the very edge of that listening stillness, walked Marshal Rowan Hale with Thorn. The great German shepherd whose steady stride matched his master's. Rowan kept one gloved hand on the lantern at his side. And though he rarely spoke, the gentleness in his gaze made townsfolk trust him more than any law he carried. Thorn trotted ahead, nose low, breath puffing in the cold. It was usually a peaceful patrol, the kind that let Rowan linger with his thoughts. But tonight he felt something shift in the snow-laden air. A faint tug, not unlike a memory brushing against the ribs. The source of that shift appeared near the well small. Bundled in wool, moving with the hesitant steps of a child trying not to disturb the hush of winter. Ira Winthorne paused when she saw them, her mittened hands tucked into her coat, her dark hair carrying tiny flakes like trapped stars. She was a quiet child, the type whose presence people noticed only when she was gone, and whose silence townsfolk misunderstood as strangeness. Mara Dunlow had already muttered twice that week that the Winthorne girl ain't right since her father passed, and such words seeped into the town like a slow poison, filling the spaces where kindness should have lived. Ira stood very still as Thorn approached. The dog stopped a foot from her, amber eyes warm but wary, sensing the fragile shape of her heart. Rowan watched closely, surprised by the softening of Thorn's posture. He had seen the dog gentle himself for injured animals, but never for a child he barely knew. Then Ira raised her hand. Two small fingers pressed to her chest in a gesture so subtle Rohan almost missed it. It was a signal made not in fear, but in longing, something between a greeting and a plea. Thorn responded instantly. He bowed his head, nudging her glove with his nose, breath warm against the wool. And for the first time in months, a ghost of a smile quivered on Ira's lips. Rowan stepped closer, lowering his lantern. "Evenin', Miss Ira." She did not answer in words, but she looked at him with eyes that carried too much winter for a child her age. When Rowan lifted a hand to adjust her scarf, she did not flinch. Thorn lingered beside her, one paw slightly forward as if claiming her. Lysandra Winthorne hurried from the tailor shop, worry etched into her tired face. "Ira, sweetheart, there you are." She thanked Rowan softly, though her voice held the frayed edges of someone who used gratitude more often than sleep. When she placed a protective arm around her daughter, Ira didn't pull away, but cast one last glance at Thorn before allowing herself to be guided home. Rowan watched them disappear into the falling snow, feeling the peculiar ache that came when two quiet souls recognized each other across the noise of the world. Thorn stood beside him, ears back, as if memorizing the direction she'd gone. The next morning brought a heavier snowfall, coating the town in a blanket so thick, footsteps sank deep and breath turned crystalline. Ira walked to school alone, her boots barely making prints before the wind swept them smooth again. She passed Mara Dunlow and her clutch of friends outside the bakery, their whispers rising like smoke. "That child draws shadows," Mara said. "Not even lowering her voice. Should have been sent to family out east," another woman murmured. "Since her father died, she's been off. And that dog, did you see how it looked at her? Unnatural." Ira kept walking, though the words curled like hooks behind her ribs. She tightened her grip on her school books, lifting her chin with a bravery that looked small but felt enormous. Thorn, somewhere blocks away, paused suddenly on patrol, ears pricking as if he caught the echo of her sadness on the wind. Later that day, Rowan found Ira by the frost-laced riverbank, sitting alone while the other children played far beyond the bend. Thorn reached her first, settling beside her with a heavy thud, pressing his warm side against her cold one. She leaned into him lightly, as if unsure she deserved the comfort. Rowan approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Trouble at school?" She didn't answer, but she lifted two fingers against low, careful her silent language. Thorn nudged her hand in response. Sealing a bond, Rowan felt more than understood. You've got a rare friend there, Rowan said gently. Thorn, don't take too many. A faint blush crept into her cheeks. A warmth Winter couldn't steal. She looked at Rowan then, the kind of look that asked if adults could be trusted. He met her gaze without flinching, offering a small nod that said yes, yes. You are safe with me, with us. But Winter, as always, kept its secrets. That evening, Rowan heard talk of a figure lurking near the old grain mill, fresh prints in the snow. Lantern light flickering where no lantern should be. Elias Berneck was seen near the same path, tall and broad-shouldered, a man the town had long decided to mistrust. The gossipers connected dots that weren't theirs to connect. Rowan listened quietly, knowing fear made liars of lips and cowards of hearts. Still, unease settled in his chest. As the winter festival approached, the town filled with a delicate hum, laughter drifting between snow-dusted stalls. Lanterns glowing through the frost, music trembling in the air. Ira walked beside Lysandra, trying to lose herself in the warmth of the gathering. But crowds pressed in too tightly, voices overlapping in a dizzying blur, and she slipped away for a moment of quiet. She found it in the narrow alley between the bakery and the church. There the wind whispered against the stones, carrying only the scent of cinnamon and cold. She exhaled shakily, letting her shoulders relax until she sensed movement at the edge of the alley. A figure stepped closer, obscured by shadow and snowfall. The shape was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, footsteps deliberate on the frozen ground. Ira froze. Her throat tightened. Her voice, so rarely used, would not come. The figure continued forward with the slow confidence of someone who believed no one else was watching. Ira's breath hitched. Her heartbeat trembled. And then something deep within, older than her grief, older even than her silence, reminded her of a gesture her father once taught her. A signal meant for moments when words abandoned her, with a hand that shook like a leaf in winter's fist. She lifted her fingers to her chest too. Small, silent, certain. Far across the festival grounds, buried within a sea of lanterns and music, Thorn stopped mid-step. His ears snapped upward. His eyes burned with instant recognition. He ran. Lanterns toppled behind him as people shouted in surprise. But Thorn didn't slow. He tore across the snow, past Rowan, past vendors, past children spinning sparklers in the frost. Rowan followed, heart pounding, trusting the dog more than his own instincts. Thorn rounded the corner of the alley, just as the figure moved. Closer to Ira, the dog's bark shattered the winter hush. A fierce, booming warning that rattled the stones. The figure jerked back. Rowan arrived moments later. Lantern swinging, voice steady but sharp. Step away from her. The figure hesitated for a single breath before fleeing into the darkness. Boots carving frantic tracks through the snow, Rowan knelt beside Ira, his breath rushing in clouds. You all right? Did he touch you? She shook her head, trembling. Thorn pressed himself against her, shielding her from the cold and the fear. The townspeople soon gathered, whispers rising like wind-blown ash. What happened? Who was that? That girl's cursed. I swear trouble finds her. Ira lowered her gaze, shame creeping across her face, even though she had done nothing wrong. Rowan saw it and softened his voice. You did the right thing, Ira. You called for help. And it worked. Thorn licked her hand gently, as if to echo his agreement. But the snow around them told a different story, tracks leading into the woods. Into deeper winter, into a truth wind hell Ridge wasn't ready to face, and though the danger had passed for the moment, Rowan felt it in his bones. The night was far from over. The snow had shown them only one shadow. More waited in the trees, still for that single breath of time. As Thorn sat guard with his warm flank pressed against Ira, the alley felt safe, almost sacred, a momentary peace before the storm. A soft ending that promised quietly, urgently, that the story was only just beginning. Winter deepened after the festival night, settling over Windhell Ridge like a heavy quilt stitched with secrets. The alley incident clung to the town's nerves, But the whispers, the whispers shifted their attention toward Ira once more. They floated through doorways and drifted beneath windows. Muttering of curses and strange children, of shadows that followed the Winthorne family like hungry ghosts. And yet every morning after, when Lysandra opened their front door, she would find Thorne sitting on the porch steps, a silent sentinel carved from loyalty and snow. He waited for Ira with unwavering patience, his breath feathering in the cold, while his gaze scanned the roads for danger. Rowan didn't announce it, but everyone could see that he had doubled his patrol rounds. His footprints now pairing with Thorne's wider marks along every snowy street. Something in the night had unsettled him, not because he feared violence, but because he had seen the way Ira shook afterward, her small fingers clutching Thorne's fur as though he were the last warm thing left in the world. And Rowan knew that fear like an old wound. He recognized the quietness that grows not from shyness, but from being shaped by sorrow. The town's gossip tended to fasten itself to the wrong man, and Elias Bernac had felt its barbs for years. His solitary habits and broad-shouldered silence made him an easy target. When Rowan asked him to talk, Elias met him outside the feed store, snow melting in his beard, eyes weary but honest. The conversation flowed in low tones, the kind men use when the truth is too fragile to speak loudly. Elias admitted he had been watching the grain mill not to haunt it, but because someone else had returned to Windhell Ridge, a drifter who once wronged his family. Someone dangerous enough to follow through on threats most men forget to make. Rowan listened without judgment, understanding that danger often wore the same coat as loneliness. It wasn't Elias the town should fear. But fear had never been a fair historian. It wrote its stories with the ink of suspicion and the quills of half-truths. Rowan asked only one thing of Elias: honesty going forward. Elias nodded, posture stiff, as though used to being doubted. But there was something in his eyes Rowan recognized, a longing to be believed. To be seen as more than the shadows people had painted him into. The snowfall thickened in the days that followed, reshaping the landscape into a maze of white hills and whispering trees. Ira walked to school bundled tightly, her boots sinking deep with every hesitant step. Thorne shadowed her from behind, never too close, never too far. He had learned her rhythm, the way she paused before crossing the narrow bridge. How she pulled her scarf up to her nose whenever she felt watched. He didn't need orders. His loyalty was older than training, older even than instinct. It was devotion. But winter holds its tempests, not only in wind and frost, it hides them in people too. It happened just after dawn, on the coldest morning yet. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, the kind of cold that made breath feel like breaking glass. Ira had risen early, hoping to avoid the gossiping ladies who crowded the bakery steps after sunrise. She walked quietly through the untouched snow, the world muted beneath the sky's dull blue glow. Thorne sensed the change first. His head lifted abruptly, ears slicing the silence. The hair along his spine bristled, and his breath hitched in a single alert exhale. Ira turned, confused by his tension, just as the creak of wood cut through the morning stillness. A sleigh emerged from the tree line, drawn by a mottled horse whose reins were held by a thick-coated man. Ira recognized nothing about him, but something about the way he watched her made her heart drop like a stone through ice. She tried to step back, but the snow was deep, and her feet sank. The man moved quickly, too quickly. His hand gripped her arm before she could gasp. His voice was low, icy, unfamiliar. Her breath evaporated in a silent cry. She tried to scream, but her voice unused, fragile retreated into her chest. Panic carved itself into her bones. But she remembered her father's hands guiding hers long ago, teaching her that not all speech lived in the throat. Some of it lived in the fingers, two trembling fingers pressed against her chest. That signaled her last fragment of courage flashed like a flare through the cold. Thorne exploded into motion. He bounded across the snow with a furious, unstoppable force, claws carving deep marks in the frozen ground. His bark thundered through the morning, carrying across empty fields and echoing through the town's outskirts. Rowan, already heading their way, recognized that bark instantly. It wasn't alert. It wasn't warning. It was a cry for urgency. Thorne reached the sleigh as the man yanked Ira upward. With a leap that defied gravity, Thorn latched onto the back of the sleigh, snarling, jaws snapping inches from the man's coat. The horse lurched forward in panic, sleigh skidding wildly across the ice. Ira clung to the edge, her mittened hands slipping. The world blurred around her, Zeno, flying, wind slicing, fear pounding in her ears. Rowan sprinted after them, boots slamming against the snow, breath tearing out in clouds. He shouted for the drifter to stop, but fear had already seized the man's spine. He cracked the reins again, desperate to outrun the law, the dog, the truth. The sleigh struck a frozen rut. Time broke open. The sleigh tipped sideways, lifting into the air before slamming into the snow with a sickening crash. Ira was thrown free, tumbling across the frost until she struck adrift and disappeared into it. Thorn rolled, scrambled, and lunged back to his feet, racing to her side. He curved his massive body over hers, shielding her from the swirling snow, his chest heaving with raw, feral protectiveness. Rowan reached them moments later, falling to his knees. His hands shook as he brushed the snow from Ira's face, calling her name with a softness that trembled on the edge of breaking. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and wet and shining with fear and relief. She lifted her hand toward Thorn, fingers small, trembling, but alive. The dog lowered his head to her palm, nuzzling her with a softness that almost undid Rowan entirely. The drifter lay tangled near the broken sleigh, dazed. Elias arrived soon after, breathless, ropes in hand. Without waiting for praise or questions, he bound the drifter's wrists with firm, decisive knots. Redemption flickered across his face, not triumph, just quiet completion of a duty no one had believed he carried. As the townsfolk began to gather, their whispers stumbled into silence. They looked at Ira not with suspicion now, but with awe, with shame, with the kind of humbled respect only truth can carve. Mara Dunlow covered her mouth, her earlier words suddenly bitter on her tongue. Lysandra ran through the snow, tears streaking her cheeks. She collapsed beside her daughter, gathering Ira into her arms, pressing her forehead to hers, as though anchoring her to the world. Rowan stepped back to give them room, but Thorn remained close, sitting guard like a stone wall against fate itself. When Ira finally spoke, her voice was thin as the edge of a snowflake. "Thorn, thank you." The simplicity of it struck deeper than any scream. Rowan felt it settle in his chest like a thaw's, low, warm, impossible to ignore. Lysandra looked at him then, eyes soft with a gratitude that said more than words ever could. And Rohan, caught between the weight of fear and the quiet miracle before him, felt something shift, something tender, something enduring, something hopeful. The days that followed were gentler. Windhell Ridge thawed, not in temperature, but in spirit. People walked slower, spoke softer, offered apologies instead of rumors. Elias found himself welcomed into conversations he once avoided. Lysandra found Rowan at her door more often, offering help without expectation. And Ira found her voice not loud, never loud, but growing, blooming, like a fragile flower daring to open despite the cold. Thorn remained at her side, her steadfast guardian, her winter shadow. Some stories end in noise. This one ended in understanding. Yet even as peace returned, winter still whispered in Rowan's mind, reminding him that stories rarely end the moment we believe. They do, they linger, they echo, they wait for the next breath. For now, though, Windhell Ridge rested, and somewhere in the soft, quiet Ira practiced her voice beside Thorn, speaking into the warm fur of the dog who had answered her silent call when no one else could. If this tale warmed a quiet part of you, follow along for more whispered stories carried on winter winds.